Today is May 4, 2018, and we are in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, studying the historicity of the Exodus. Let's start with asking our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, once again, thank you for your help. Please help us as we study this subject to understand the truth of the Exodus, to understand what it means for us today, and to be able to be changed by what we learn so that we can do what's right now in our own generation. Thank you so much. Guide us by right principle. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so as you guys know, we have been studying the historicity of the Exodus because of the fact that we have come to realize that we can't just take for granted as true anything that's written in a collection of writings called the Bible simply because it's in that collection. The idea of a biblical canon is something that is not scriptural when looking at the writings within any of those canons. And it is something which is not helpful and can even be harmful, which I won't go into explaining why right now, simply because we've explained it so many times on other calls. But this leaves us with needing to look at not only writings which are outside of the canons with which we have grown up or the canons which we accepted when joining a certain denomination. We also need to look at the writings within those canons and to consider whether the traditions concerning them are actually true. When thinking about the Exodus, of course, the 5 books of the Bible are of primary concern. And these 5 books have been claimed by the tradition of Jews and Christians for many centuries to have been written by Moses. And in examining that claim, we have found that it is certainly not a claim which these books themselves make. In fact, these books evidence from within themselves that they do not claim to be written by Moses, nor were they written by Moses. Now, we've talked about the follow-up questions to that conclusion several times, such as, who did write the Torah, if not Moses? And was its author or were its authors people who claimed to be inspired by God? Did they have an accurate view of the history which they told? And in answer to those questions, we have found that so far as we know, none of the authors of the Torah claim to be writing under the influence of divine inspiration. And in terms of history, well, that's what we are presently examining. So far as we can tell, scholars are right that there were 4 primary texts that were combined to make up the Torah as we have it, with the addition of some other minor texts. Those texts are called J, E, P, and D. And really, when it comes to the story of the Exodus, in the book of Exodus, it's really just 3 of those sources, J, E, and P. Last year, we read through the Exodus story according to those various sources and got a feel for what each of them has to say, and the fact that each flows very well when read separated from the others. And this year, we're trying to get a feel for the Exodus itself. And it's not that we want to find out whether the Exodus happened or not for the sake of curiosity or merely for the sake of history. We want to understand what happened because this is an event in which it is claimed that Yahweh, the God of Israel, acted. And also the reports of Yahweh's activity in relation to this event differ from one another. And some of the claims concerning Yahweh in relation to this event certainly portray Yahweh as having a character which we must consider to be morally reprehensible. For example, the e-source contains within it something else which it used as a source, found in Exodus chapters 21 to 23, and this is supposed to be the covenant that Yahweh made with Israel. But in this covenant code, it actually has instructions and commands which condone not only slavery, but the beating of slaves so long as they do not die within 2 or 3 days. Well, a God which would condone something like that is a God to be rejected. Even if that God does exist, that God is certainly not one worthy of serving. And that isn't the God that we know from the Odes of Solomon, and the Odes of Solomon specifically reject slavery, or the Book of Revelation, or Ellen White, or the Rod and Branch Messages. The deities we have come to know are nothing like the Yahweh presented, at least in Exodus 21 in the passage condoning beating slaves, or in Leviticus 25 in the passage condoning perpetually owning slaves. Furthermore, the way Yahweh is presented in the book of Joshua is also strikingly problematic in terms of morality, in that Yahweh in Joshua is said to be commanding several sessions of genocidal behavior. And Joshua, who is presented in the book of Joshua as Yahweh's spokesperson and someone who is acting in harmony with the will of Yahweh as he received by means of Moses, he is presented with somewhat of a morally reprehensible character as well, doing things like having his commanders bring forward 5 kings who had hidden in a cave and putting their feet on the necks of these kings, at which point Joshua tells his commanders, in this manner, Yahweh will hand over all of our enemies to us. And then he kills those 5 kings, hangs them until evening, and then puts them back in the cave in which they were hiding and covers the cave. Okay, so just to remind ourselves not to think that anything is okay just because it's in the Bible, imagine if anyone today did that. If Donald Trump defeated 5 nations and found the rulers of those nations had the commanders of the U.S. military put their feet on their necks and then slaughter them, that would be morally reprehensible. And if you imagine it, let's say someone happens to really favor Donald Trump and maybe might think it's okay if he does it. Well, think of someone else, some other ruler. Think of Saddam Hussein doing that same thing. Obviously, there's a problem. Because there are certain moral problems with the way Yahweh is presented in some of these Exodus narratives, and because that presentation of Yahweh is nothing like the Yahwehs that we know, this really calls for our investigation to see, well, what's going on here? So another thing that I'll mention is that Yahweh is not presented with this bad character in every passage related to the Exodus. Some passages really emphasize the mercy and long-suffering and love of Yahweh, and actually present Yahweh as emancipating slaves and freeing slaves and not being pro-slavery at all, but really being the rescuer of slaves. And Yahweh is presented as wanting people to love their neighbors as themselves, and all of these great commandments that anyone can recognize are in harmony with love and good principle. So we really need to get to the bottom of the Exodus, and so we have been doing so by looking at the Song of the Sea in Exodus chapter 15. And linguistically, the Song of the Sea is very ancient. It may go back to the 13th century BC or the 12th century. It's very old, maybe even contemporary with the Exodus, or at least nearly contemporary with the Exodus. And it seems to have been at least one of the primary sources used by the author of the J text. And the J text is very likely the earliest among the sources of the Torah. So within the earliest source, we have the earliest subsource. So that's why we've started there. And so far it's been interesting. It's hard to really fully address this subject in the calls because there's just so much to look at. And, we don't want to end up being on here for 4 hours every night trying to get to the bottom of this when even that wouldn't do it. It requires individual study. So the hope is to be able to each study this on our own and then come together and share what we have found. And yes, we have to do that with a somewhat focused manner, looking at, bit at a time, rather than just focusing on the subject of the Exodus as a whole, because that's very, very broad. So it's been interesting. We won't be able by the end of the feast to get to the bottom of the whole question of the Exodus, most likely, because again, it's a big subject. But I hope that we're starting to get some sort of feel for what's going on, at least with the sources, perhaps not yet with the events reflected in them. But we'll see exactly where it goes. But, it's kind of tricky for us to find exactly the right balance, because our focus in studying the history isn't just about history. It's also about the message and the character of our Heavenly Family. But in order to accurately assess that, we have to address the history first. We can't put the cart before the horse, because how else do we establish exactly what the message was when we have conflicting historical records concerning it. So that's kind of where we're at with it. And in studying Exodus 15 so far, it seems like right now we're kind of at the place where there's still a lot to comment on regarding the Song of the Sea. And hopefully we'll cover some ground tonight in regard to that. But we've asked questions like, is this presenting a picture of the Exodus that includes a crossing through a parted Red Sea? Or is it describing Pharaoh's army as being tossed into the sea, though perhaps without an actual parting of it, where you have basically a wall of water on either side of people walking through on a dry path? And, we've talked about both possibilities. The last kind of thing that was expressed is thinking that it's probably describing something other than parted walls, and I tend to think that that's the case. And then we were also looking at what is probably more accurately called the Song of Miriam, which is just contained in Exodus 15, verse 20. And we were trying to assess what source this may be a part of. And where we ended last night is I was expressing how it seems to fit best within the J source. So with all that said, does anyone have any comments or questions regarding anything we've talked about so far in relationship to the Song of the Sea? All right. Well, in that case, I would like to go back to the beginning of it, and we'll try to go through it and make some observations. We want to see what we can discover concerning this text in basically every aspect. We want to know, does this text in any way indicate when it was written, by whom, what does it actually describe, and how does its description reflect or not reflect actual history? So these are some of the main questions that we have in mind. So I'll go back to the beginning of Exodus 15, starting from verse 1. The first part of the verse is not actually part of the song, but introduces it. It says, "Then Moses and the children of Israel sang this song to Yahweh. And they said," saying, and then it goes into a song. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is that J, which is the source that we're reading here in Exodus 15, is saying that this song was sung by Moses and the children of Israel. It doesn't make a claim as to who wrote it, but it claims that they sang this song. And within the context of J, it appears that this was sung practically right after the destruction of Pharaoh's army. So I'll just read the preceding context, going back to chapter 14, verse 30. "And Yahweh saved Israel from Egypt's hand that day. And Israel saw Egypt dead on the seashore. And Israel saw the big hand that Yahweh had used against Egypt. And the people feared Yahweh, and they trusted in Yahweh and in Moses his servant. Then Moses and the children of Israel sang this song to Yahweh. And they said," sang, and then it quotes the whole song. And then after that, the next thing in J may be verse 20, which has the song of Miriam, and then quotes the line that she is supposed to have sung which is really the beginning of the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15. And then partway through verse 22, it says, and they went 3 days in the wilderness, and they did not find water. And then they go to a place called Marah, and the story continues. And now, if I remember correctly, earlier in J, before actually leaving Egypt, Moses was speaking to Pharaoh and saying, we must go out 3 days into the wilderness to keep a feast and to sacrifice to our God, etc., etc. Now, that being the case, with this reference to going out 3 days into the wilderness, it implies that this song was sung the very day of this event at the sea. That seems to be the implication within J. So I just want to kind of test that. Does this song look like a song that was sung the day that this event happened? Is that something that's likely? Is it something that's unlikely? And whatever the case, why? So does anyone have any comments on that? So if, just in case, sorry, is someone trying to comment now?
I was just going to say, we know we have an enemy that doesn't want us to know God, so got to be suspect of everything.
Sure. So in terms of, analyzing this question, just in case people are drawing a blank on how to answer it, like, okay, well, again, I'll restate the question. Jay seems to be claiming that this song, which is contained in Exodus 15 verses 1b to 18, was sung on the day that this event took place at the sea. This event at the sea is Pharaoh's armies being tossed into it and Israel thus being saved from the Egyptian forces. So the question is it likely this is something that was sung on that day, or is it unlikely? And whatever the case may be, why? So what evidence do we have? So, obviously we don't want to just say, oh, well, maybe it's this just because, or maybe it's the other thing just because. We want to be able to have reasons one way or the other, and hopefully evidence supporting whatever hypothesis we put forward. But again, it's okay for our hypothesis to be wrong. That's part of the process of putting forth a hypothesis and then testing it. So if people are kind of drawing a blank and you really just don't know one way or the other, whether it's likely that this was sung on the day or perhaps not, then maybe think about and feel free to comment upon how it is that we might go about answering that question.
Okay, I'm thinking that it could not have been sang that day because of starting in verse 14 and perhaps until 16 is what I'm seeing so far. Okay, verse 14 saying, peoples heard, they shuddered, shaking seas Philistines' residents, Edom's chiefs, Moab's chieftains, etc., etc. So it's going to take a while for other the neighboring, what are they? People around to hear this event, right? So I'm thinking it could not have been that same day. It would have had to been after, because how would this person know that all these other, neighboring people heard about this event? That's my that's what I just saw clearly right now.
Yeah, excellent. I totally agree, actually. And like you pointed out at the end of your comment, especially, how would this person, whoever wrote this, how would they know that these other people had heard? So not only do you have to allow time for the other nations to hear of this event, the person who wrote this has to be familiar with the fact that they heard. So it's most likely not going to happen on that day that one of the Israelites runs ahead, tells the Philistines, the Edomites, and the Moabites, and the Canaanites. So in other words, you have to even get all the way to Canaan, telling them, and people actually believe it, and they're scared about it, and then runs back to the wilderness and tells the Israelites, hey, everyone's scared. And then someone has to write the song with that knowledge, and then Moses and the children of Israel have to learn it and then sing it. So, yeah, that seems very, very, very unlikely, to the point where I think we can say it's pretty certain that that's not how it happened. Thus, this portrayal in J must be considered to be inaccurate history. It seems like it's applying the singing of the song to a time prior to which it could be sung. So it's kind of anachronistically putting this song further back in time than it can be appropriately placed. So now that this kind of aspect of verses 14 to 16 has been pointed out, is there anything else that we can learn from that? Does that at all indicate to us when this song may have been written?
It could have been written like around after the people that's been described in Exodus chapter 15. It could have been written after the people have found out, because, like you guys explained already, how there had to be a communication first in order to really find out that other people have found out about this devastation or whatever. Were people being scared?
Sure, yeah. It would have to be at some point after these people hear about this event, and after the authors hear that these people had heard this event and learned about their response. So, yeah, that's certainly the case. And would we be able to figure out kind of when that might be, when those circumstances might be in place? Could we narrow it down any further? So would there have to be anything that would have to happen in order for the people to hear about it, like these surrounding peoples to hear about it, and in order for the Israelites to know that they had heard about it?
Didn't the Israelites tell the stories of what happened to them to their children, and their children told it to their children to get out that way?
Sorry, Leroy, I can't even really make out what you're saying. Would you be able to, I don't know exactly what needs to be done to change the audio, but maybe you could try something else.
Okay.
Obviously, they have to have crossed paths and, the story that we know was that they were in the desert for 40 years. So obviously that story, well, unless this was written after the 40 years, after the Israelites intermingled with other cultures, obviously.
That might imply that, that's definitely a possibility. I don't remember right now if the J story has sending of spies or anything like that, because that would be another, well, that wouldn't necessarily let the other nations know, but that would be a way for them to find out something from the other nations. But yeah, it might imply that it would have to be sometime after the 40 years. Before we go much further, I just want to find out, Leroy, were you able to try anything different? And we'll see if we can hear you better. Okay, well, I'm not hearing him right now. I don't know if you're trying to speak right now, Leroy. If you are, we cannot hear you. Okay, well, I guess we'll see what happens.
Well, I was able to make out, I think, what Leroy said. And it was basically, wouldn't the children of Israel have had to tell the story to their children, and then they tell it to their children's children? And that's basically what he said. I'm not sure exactly where he was going with that, what the point was, but that's what I heard.
Okay. Okay, so
I have a comment.
Hard to say. Okay, just go ahead.
Oh, well, it might be kind of far-fetched. I don't know that I've ever read whether or not the children of Israel may or may not have crossed paths with, let's say, a caravan traveling from place to place and cutting across the desert. It could be that if the desert was ever used for caravans, trading, that type of thing, that's one way word could have been passed. It's the only way I could think of, since they were in the desert. So I decided to throw that out there. It was just a guess.
Okay, interesting, yeah. And something that I noticed as you were making your comment is that yourself, myself also, and maybe others here, but anyway, so we're kind of referring to this people here as the children of Israel while looking at the Song of the Sea. But we should remind ourselves that actually in the Song of the Sea, it doesn't specify who the quote-unquote people is. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. And in light of the idea put forward by Richard Elliott Friedman, it may not be actually the children of Israel. It may have been just the Levites. Something that I'm noticing too that might help to kind of date the song itself is this part at the end, or in verse 17 anyway. In Richard Elliott Friedman's translation, it says, "You'll bring them and plant them in your legacy's mountain, your throne's platform that you made, Yahweh, a holy place, Lord, that your hands reared." In his translation, it is in future tense, which would seem to indicate that the arrival of the the people, at Yahweh's legacy's mountain is an event future from the writing of this song. But I'm looking at another translation, the New Revised Standard Version, and in this same verse it says, "You brought them in and planted them on the mountain of your own possession, the place, O Lord, that you made your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, that your hands have established." So in that translation, it's actually past tense, which would indicate that this would have to be written at some point after this people had been established in the sanctuary or holy place of Yahweh. Now, that's kind of significant, especially if we can determine exactly what this is referring to. Is this talking about the tabernacle erected at a certain location? Or is this talking about the temple even? Because if this is talking about the temple, then that actually would require this song to be dated even to the time of Solomon. That is if, well, basically, even if it's written in future tense or past tense, whatever it may be, if it's actually referring to the temple itself, well, then it would have to be dated to Solomon's time, which would mean that the old language of this would be deliberately anachronistic. In other words, deliberately speaking with an older form of Hebrew than the Hebrew at the time it was written. But if it's just the tabernacle erected at a certain location, well, then it could be before the days of Solomon and before the days of David. So figuring out whether this is future tense or past tense or whatever, I think is important in order to kind of date the psalm and in order to determine, and also determining exactly what this is referring to, or to see if it's possible to determine whether it's the wilderness tabernacle or Solomon's temple or what. So anyway, I could look this up in Hebrew to see if I'm able to recognize whether this is supposed to be, kind of what tenses this is actually in. And in the meantime, does anyone have any comments? So I guess there are no comments. I will have to refresh myself regarding the verbs being used here, or the tenses in particular. I'm recognizing them, but I know that there's certain rules concerning how the tense changes if you have a certain letter at the beginning of it, or if it's at the beginning of a sentence versus later. So I'll have to refresh myself concerning that to see whether it is actually more accurate to translate this as past or future. So that's something that is kind of, we'll have that as a pending thing. And you guys can look into that too. Like, it's something that people can look into. You can find resources that help to answer those sorts of questions, even without understanding Hebrew itself. So in that case, does anyone have any other comments or questions regarding anything that we've discussed so far about this song? Or are you guys ready for us to go back to the beginning again and see what we can learn from the song itself?
Can you hear me any better now?
Yes.
When you were talking about bringing them to the sanctuary in the mountain, I was wondering if it could be the sanctuary of their promised land. Bringing them into the promised land was come into my mind.
Yeah, that's certainly a reasonable question. The thing about it, though, is that the specific terms that are used here seem to be pretty specific to, like, the sanctuary in the sense of a temple, when it says in your legacy's mountain, even the mountain language connects it to temple, sanctuary type stuff. Your throne's platform. That phrase is only used to refer to, and this is something that we'll have to check, if it's only the temple itself, or if it's also used of the wilderness tabernacle. But it's used for just, temple, sanctuary type language. And then it refers to your holy place or your sanctuary, Lord, that your hands reared. So, it's certainly it's not an unreasonable hypothesis to think that maybe it's referring just to the land in general, but the language is certainly more characteristic of referring to the sanctuary itself. So again, this can be looked into more to see how specific we can get with that. That seems to be the general trend of the statements in verse 17.
That land was promised to Abraham for his people way back in Genesis. That's why I was thinking it might be the whole land instead of a building. But anyway.
So, the sources in the Pentateuch definitely describe the children of Israel going into the land. But again, this song is something which was apparently a source that the J author used, written before the J writing itself. And so it's not necessarily referring to the exact same thing as what is referred to in some of the other sources, like J itself or E and P, etc. It doesn't specify exactly who this people are. It just says that they are a people. And if you want to kind of look just at the song itself to try and determine what is this really saying, then you're kind of left with saying, well, it describes this people. What does it describe them going through? And where does it describe them going? And if it describes them going and being planted in the Lord's sanctuary, well, then it may very well be actually exclusive to the Levites, as Richard Elliott Friedman points out, or as he purports in his hypothesis.
I don't think they would all fit into one building. I've got another question about, I haven't got the book, the Exodus yet, but does it split up the different sources where you can read one source and then the other?
Okay, I wasn't able to make out the first part of what you were saying. Would you mind repeating that second question again?
I was kind of being silly, but I said they couldn't all fit into the sanctuary, a building.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Well, it depends on how many people we're talking about, because this doesn't specify how many people, right? So, we might think, oh, maybe they wouldn't fit, but maybe we're imagining a far larger group of people. If this is actually describing a smaller group of people, then that might not be so much of an issue. But again, it's yet to be determined exactly what size group this song is portraying. I'm not saying that it is definitely a really small group. It may or may not be, but we just have to be careful not to make assumptions concerning the size of the group this song is portraying.
Did you hear my question about the Exodus book? That is it split? I haven't got it yet, but does it split the different sources, or you can read one source and then the other?
So you're asking about where you can get a book to be able to read through the sources differentiated from each other. Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So a book that we've recommended is called The Bible with Sources Revealed, which is basically a translation of the first 5 books of the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman. And he has it color-coded to be able to distinguish between the sources. So that's a good place. And then also in the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook group earlier today, I posted a link to a Wikipedia page or some sort of wiki page, which has basically links to where you can read the sources color-coded. It doesn't agree in every particular with Richard Elliott Friedman's book, but it'll give you an idea. And maybe what we can do is tag you. In fact, Teresa's going to do that now. She's going to tag you in that post so that you don't have to go searching for it. You'll get a little notification. Then all you have to do is click on that and it'll take you right there.
Thank you. I got an iPhone now.
Okay, great.
You know, it sounded to me like he was actually asking, mentioning that he had, and I may be wrong, Leroy, but it sounded like you had ordered the book called The Exodus and that you were asking, is the Exodus separated into the different E and P and D and all that? That's what it sounded to me like you were asking.
Right, you're right.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that. So the book, The Exodus by Richard Elliott Friedman, does not contain a translation of the Pentateuch, and so it doesn't separate between the sources. It just gives Richard Elliott Friedman's perspective concerning the Exodus. So he basically gives an argument and provides evidence in favor of the historicity of the Exodus, but not the Exodus in the way that people commonly think of it, but still an Exodus nonetheless. So I think it's a pretty compelling case that he makes. I don't know about all the particulars of it, and it's something that needs to be still investigated. But yeah, if you want to really get it color-coded and just have the whole Torah like that, basically the Bible with Sources Revealed is the only book that I know of that actually contains all of that in book form. And then aside from that, there's the online version that we're connecting you with on Facebook.
Thank you.
So I'm looking at the time here, and we should wrap up within the next 5 minutes. I'm thinking maybe what I'm going to do for something a little bit different is just to read the Song of the Sea again, but to do it from a different translation. And I'll do it from one that most people don't have easily available to them, just because, hey, then people get something that you might not normally get. And there are so many translations available online that you can just find and read, and it would be great to read them. But then there are also those that are a little harder to come by. So there's one that I have that is by William Prop, and he is one of the speakers at the UCSD Exodus conference. William Prop, he's another one of those scholars who I really appreciate. Really funny guy, seems to have some pretty decent scholarship. I have really just seen a couple lectures of his and read part of an article, so I can't really comment on his work as a whole or anything like that. But he's a colleague of Richard Elliott Friedman, and they seem to agree on quite a number of things. So he actually is the one who wrote the 2-volume series on the book Exodus for the Anchor Bible Project. So Yale University had this whole Anchor Bible Project, which had several different aspects. One of those was new translations with introductions and historical critical commentaries on every book in the Bible and also apocryphal literature. And so he did 2 volumes on Exodus, and they're massive volumes. Apparently it's really good material. I haven't really read them, but there's a translation of the whole thing. So I'm just kind of scrolling to this section. Okay, there we go. So I'll read the Song of the Sea in William Propp's translation. And I'll start with the beginning of Exodus 15. So again, the first part is not actually part of the song. Then sang Moses and Israel's sons this song of Yahweh. And they said, saying, I would sing of Yahweh, for he acted exaltedly. Horse and his rider he hurled into the sea. My strength and my power / music is Yah, and he was for me as salvation. This is my God, and I exalt him, my Father's deity, and I elevate him. Yahweh, man of war, Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his force he cast into the sea, and the choice of his thirds were sunk in the Suf sea. Deeps they cover them, they went down in the depths like stone. Your right hand, Yahweh, strong in might, your right hand, Yahweh, you shatter enemy. And in your pride's greatness you break down your uprisers. You release your anger, it consumes them as straw. And with your nostrils' breath, waters were piled. Streams stood like a heap, deeps congealed in sea's heart. Enemy said, I'll pursue, overtake, a portion spoil. My gullet will be full of them. I'll empty my sword. My hand will dispossess them. You blew with your breath. Sea covered them. They sank like lead in strong waters. Who as you among gods, Yahweh? Who as you is strong in holiness, dreadful of glory, worker of wonder? You extended your right arm. Earth swallows them. You led by your grace the people which you redeemed. You guided by your might to your holiness's pasture / camp / tent. Peoples heard, they shuddered. Convulsions seized Philistia's inhabitants. Then perturbed were Edom's princes, Moab's rams, quaking seized them. Liquefied were all Canaan's inhabitants. Upon them fall fear and terror. At your limbs' greatness, they are still as stone. Till crosses your people, Yahweh, till crosses the people which you have gotten. May you bring them and plant them in your property mountain, the firm seat for your sitting / throne / dwelling you devised, Yahweh. the sanctum, my lordship, your hands founded. Yahweh, he will reign, ever and eternity. So that's the end of the Song of the Sea in William Propp's translation. So I think that's a good note to end on, kind of an interesting translation, certainly grammatically awkward in English, but I assume it's somewhat literal to the Hebrew text. So in any case, I hope that everyone found that interesting and benefited from that. And we'll bring an end to the meeting now, and then we can continue our discussion on tomorrow night's call. Would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Family, we thank you for the beautiful day today, and for all the guidance and the blessings that you're giving us. I thank you for just helping us to be able to have the tools that we need to understand and determine your will and your truth, and help us to improve in that area as well, and help us to understand when the song was written, and so we can learn more about the Exodus and learn more about you. We ask these things in the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
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 So as a quick reminder too, seriously, if anyone wants to continue this in the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook group, that's totally fine too. I know that our calls aren't enough to cover everything, so feel free to be posting in there and engage in discussion and all that. In any case, though, we'll be back on tomorrow night. So, love you all. Shalom.
Shalom.
Shalom. Good night.